What if I told you that a huge part of what we think we know about the British people is basically a myth? Well, today, we're going to use what's basically a genetic ghost map to crack open a 1,500-year-old cold case. We're using some incredible science to look back in time and finally answer the question, who really are the British?
So here's the mystery at the heart of it all. Around the year 400 AD, the Roman legions packed up and left Britain. And right after that, history gets really hazy. We know these waves of Anglo-Saxons came over from mainland Europe and everything changed. But how did it change? Did they just show up and wipe out the locals, or was something else going on? For hundreds of years, we've only been able to guess.
All right, so here's our game plan. We'll kick things off with that Dark Age mystery, then get into the amazing science that finally cracked the case. We're going to uncover a pretty shocking discovery that just shatters a core myth about British identity. Then we'll reveal this hidden map of ancient tribes written right in our DNA. And from there, we'll finally solve that Britain versus Anglo-Saxon question and see what it tells us about all the other great waves of British history.
Okay, so try to picture it. You're in Britain, somewhere between 400 and 600 AD. The Roman Empire, this massive organizing force, has crumbled. Its towns are literally being abandoned, and new groups of people, the Anglo-Saxons, are arriving from places we now call Denmark and Germany. The actual historical records from this time are so fuzzy, leaving this giant question mark over one of the most important periods in the island's entire history.
For a long time, historians were split right down the middle, with two totally different theories. The first one, replacement, is pretty brutal. It suggests the Anglo-Saxons just wiped out or pushed out the native Britons. And, that would explain why the language, the pottery, even farming methods changed so dramatically. But the other theory, adoption, says, no way, there was no genocide. The native Britons just started living like the new, powerful arrivals. So which was it? A violent conquest or a cultural shift? We just didn't have the tools to know for sure.
That is, until now. What if we could build a kind of genetic time machine? A way to look back and see what really happened? Well, in 2015, a truly groundbreaking study published in the journal Nature did exactly that, using our own DNA to peer deep into Britain's ancestral past.
And listen, we're not talking about a small sample size here. Researchers from Oxford University analyzed the DNA of 2,000 people from all across the United Kingdom. That kind of scale gives the results incredible statistical power and lets us see the past with stunning detail.
Now, the real genius of this study was who they sampled. See, to hear the faint genetic whispers from ancient history, you have to tune out all the modern noise from people moving around over the last century. So they found people whose 4 grandparents were all born in the same rural area. This trick essentially gave them a genetic snapshot of that specific place from over 100 years ago, which in turn opened a window into a much, much deeper past.
And when the results started rolling in, the very first major finding was a complete shocker. It basically took one of the most fundamental ideas about British identity, something a lot of us just assume is true, and turned it completely on its head. Even the experts were stunned by this. Professor Mark Robinson, one of the lead archaeologists on the project, said he went into it assuming he'd find this clear, single Celtic genetic group running all the way up the western side of Britain, the so-called Celtic fringe. It's a common idea. But the DNA? Well, the DNA told a totally different story.
And here it is, the bombshell. Genetically speaking, there is no single Celtic people in the UK. The idea that people in Cornwall, Wales, and Scotland are all part of one ancient, unified genetic group turns out it's a myth. The DNA just doesn't back it up.
So let's break that down. What does it actually mean? Well, the data shows that the people of Cornwall, for instance, are genetically much more similar to the English than they are to other Celtic groups in Wales or Scotland. It's a huge revelation. Now, this doesn't mean Celtic culture isn't real. It's an incredibly powerful cultural and linguistic heritage, for sure. But it's not a single, unified genetic identity.
Okay, so if the DNA shattered the myth of one big Celtic group, what did it find instead? Well, something way more complex and, honestly, way more fascinating. It revealed a hidden genetic tapestry made of 17 distinct ancient groups of people still living in Britain today.
And this is where it gets absolutely mind-blowing. The researchers took their new genetic map and laid it over a political map of Britain from around the year 600, and the match was stunning. Many of today's distinct genetic groups live within the exact same borders as ancient post-Roman tribal kingdoms. Think about that. These regional identities aren't just a few hundred years old. They are baked into the DNA and have survived for at least 1,500 years.
And the details here are just incredible. For example, there's a sharp genetic line between Cornwall and Devon that follows the modern county border almost perfectly. In Wales, it turns out people from North Wales and South Wales are genetically really different from each other. And it's not just the Celtic areas. West Yorkshire has its own unique genetic fingerprint, and people in northern England are actually genetically closer to folks in Scotland than they are to people in southern England.
So now that we have this incredibly detailed genetic map of ancient Britain, we can finally go back to our original cold case. What really happened when the native Britons met the invading Anglo-Saxons?
And the answer from the DNA is clear. It was not a replacement. The Anglo-Saxons didn't wipe out the Britons. Instead, they mixed. The DNA of most modern English people has only a modest amount of Anglo-Saxon ancestry. The vast majority of England's genetic heritage comes from those native Britons who were there all along. The English are, and have been for a very long time, a blend.
But here's a crucial little detail. It wasn't an instant melting pot. The genes suggest that for the first 100 years or so, the two groups lived mostly side by side in separate communities. It's like two rivers flowing in parallel before they finally started to merge into one, creating the population we now call the English.
So, what about all the other famous invaders in British history? This powerful genetic lens doesn't just work on the Anglo-Saxons. It gives us a chance to see the real impact of the Vikings, the Normans, the whole shebang.
And the results here are just wow. So, we know the Anglo-Saxons left that modest but widespread genetic mark. But what about the Vikings, who ruled a huge chunk of England called the Danelaw? Almost no genetic trace at all. Theirs was a political and military takeover, not a population replacement. Now up in the Orkney Islands, it's a different story. You see a clear and lasting Norwegian DNA signature. But the most famous of all, the Norman conquest of 1066, genetically, there's no detectable trace. Nothing.
So, what's the big takeaway here? It's that the story of Britain isn't one of conquest after conquest where each new group wipes out the last. It's a story of mixing, of adaptation, and of the quiet, deep-rooted persistence of the people who were already there, whose ancient identities survived all those invasions to create the complex, rich country we see today.
This whole genetic story really proves that our identities aren't fixed. They're not set in stone. They're constantly being shaped and reshaped by history. So, knowing that our past is this messy, fascinating, incredible blend of peoples and cultures, what does that mean for how we see ourselves, and maybe more importantly, how we see each other today?